So in this screencast, we are going to begin to look at the circulatory system, specifically the heart, which is a part of that circulatory system. Recall that this is part of this larger system, the cardiovascular system, which includes both the respiratory and circulatory system. So to begin, the heart is pretty much the main player in your circulatory system, and I just want to start with a very basic question. Where is your heart? If I asked you to put your hand over your heart right now, I'm guessing most of you would put your hand kind of right here, sort of in the upper left corner of your chest. That's actually not quite right. If you were to cover your heart is actually more dead center. It sits right beneath the sternum, and then it leans to the left. It's also a bit lower than a lot of people realize. It rests right above the diaphragm, kind of at the base of where your ribs come together, and then again it leans to the left. You feel your heartbeat on the left side because this is where the left ventricle is, which is one of the more powerful chambers, the most powerful chamber in your heart is. We'll talk more about that later. But the heart is actually pretty dead center. Um, so we left off looking at the respiratory system and saying how oxygen from the environment is able to move through a series of tubes into our lungs, ultimately ending up in these little alveoli. And I think in passing, kind of mentioned that the oxygen goes from the alveoli into the bloodstream. So we're going to pick up there, and I just want to remind ourselves why we care about this. Well, oxygen, remember, is central. Clearly, you can't live long without it. And the reason it's central is because it is necessary for this process called cellular respiration, which makes the vast majority of energy that your body needs. So cellular respiration, remember, it takes glucose, combines with oxygen, and produces CO2 and water as waste. So with the respiratory system, we saw how we take oxygen in and breathe oxygen out, but now we need to figure out how do we get that oxygen to every single cell in our body. So the heart plays a key role in this. It is the heart that pumps those gases throughout the body because those gases are now in the blood. So I'm going to pause here and we're going to color in a little bit this sheet.
So if you have a printed version of this sheet, that is helpful. It's in the study guide, which is posted to Schoology. If you don't, you could probably just recreate it. All you really need is this box and then some lines, and these could just be circles. Right, body, lungs in here. But figure out somehow how to get this diagram, and then a blue and red marker would be useful too. And what we're going to do is look at the flow of blood through the circulatory system. So basically the heart is 4 chambers, and we're going to represent those 4 chambers as a simple box. And it's obviously not a box, but representing it this way just helps us track the flow of blood much easier, in my opinion. So we're going to start in the lungs, and as we discussed in our last chapter there, we learned that the lungs is where oxygen is picked up. And so I'm going to use red to represent oxygen-rich blood, and I'm going to use blue to represent oxygen poor blood. And so in the lungs, there's basically oxygen poor blood that goes into the lungs. So I'm just going to color this bottom half in blue just to kind of indicate that the blood going into the lungs is poor in oxygen. But then when you breathe, oxygen from the lungs diffuses into the alveoli, which then diffuses into the blood vessels, making that blood oxygen rich. So the lungs is where the blood goes from oxygen poor to oxygen rich. And then that blood is returned to the heart, and it travels through a series of veins to the first chamber of the heart, which is the left atrium. It then is pumped to the left ventricle, and then it's pumped out again through a series of blood vessels to the body. Now, obviously, there's a lot of branching that happens here as it goes to the head, to the arms, to the legs, everywhere. But we're just going to represent all that branching just as this one thing and say it goes to the body. So the blood that's first reaching your body's cells is, in fact, going to be oxygen-rich. So you can color that in red. Make it nice and pretty for the perfectionists in the room. But then when your body cells are exposed to that blood, they're going to take in that oxygen and use it for cellular respiration. So the oxygen goes into your body cells, and that will leave the blood oxygen poor. And so we switch back to the blue. And this oxygen poor blood then returns to the heart, again through a series of veins. This time it goes to the right atrium. The right atrium pumps it to the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle pumps it back to the lungs, where this cycle repeats. More oxygen diffuses into the bloodstream from the lungs, and then we go back to the heart, and then back to the body, and then back to the heart, and back to the body, and it just kind of goes from the lungs to the heart, to the body to the heart, from the lungs to the heart, to the body to the heart, so on and so forth.
So now that you understand how the blood flows through the body and how it's moved by the heart, there's this other question, which is how does that oxygen move from the lungs into the blood and then from the blood to the body cells? Well, to get at this question, you may remember something from biology last year called concentration gradients, this idea that if you have a lot of something on one side of the membrane and none of it on the other side of a membrane, things tend to move from a high concentration to a lower concentration until they reach what we call equilibrium, where there's equal amounts on both sides. And this is simply due to the random movement of molecules. If they're randomly moving, obviously they can only go in one direction here, and so they do. And then, if there's more over here than here, we see more movement that way than that way. And at equilibrium, they're kind of moving back and forth at equal rates. And then note that each substance does this individually. So purple and orange are independent. Both are going to move back and forth until both are in equilibrium. Well, this concept from last year is pretty darn central to understanding how the respiratory system works. So again, we're going to look back at that picture that you have from the study guide, and I'm going to play a little clip where you can see how those gases move.
Okay, so on this bottom half of the diagram, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how diffusion actually takes place. Like, how does the oxygen and why does the oxygen go from the lungs into the blood? So to do that, I'm going to make a little table. So we have the alveolus and the blood. I'm just going to kind of make a little box, do that, and then and we're going to track oxygen levels and CO2 levels. Now, when you take a deep breath, your lungs are getting air in it. Air is about 20% oxygen and about, I think it's like 0.03% CO2. So the air that's entering the alveolus, this is a single alveolus right here, is going to be high in oxygen, but low in CO2. Meanwhile, the blood going to the lungs, if you look up, you scroll up a little bit, the blood going to the lungs is low in oxygen for reasons we already discussed. So it's going to be low in oxygen, but high in CO2. And it's high in CO2 because, again, cellular respiration is happening in your body cells, and that carbon dioxide is a waste product of that. And that's kicked out into the bloodstream. So you may remember from biology, whenever you have a membrane that's separating two things, and then there's a difference in concentration, high concentration on one side, low concentration of another, then something called diffusion happens, where there's a net movement of molecules from the region of high to low concentration. And that process causes oxygen molecules to just randomly move from the alveoli into the bloodstream, and diffusion also causes CO2 to randomly move from the bloodstream into the alveolus. And so that's how gas exchange happens. It's just straight up diffusion. The same thing happens here in your body's cells. I'll make another little box. Track oxygen, track CO2. In this case, the blood, if you look up top here, you'll notice the blood going to your body cells is high in oxygen, but low in CO2. But your cells are actively carrying out cellular respiration. And so because they're using oxygen in that process, your cells are low in oxygen and high in CO2. And so once again, we see that when the blood approaches your cells that are actively carrying out cellular respiration, there's a higher concentration of oxygen in the blood than in the cells, and so straight up diffusion happens, and oxygen goes into your body cells, CO2 leaves your body cells and goes into the blood.
So at the core of all this is this process, diffusion. And diffusion is what causes oxygen to enter the bloodstream and CO2 to enter the lungs. Um, and you can kind of see a better picture there. Oxygen goes into the blood, CO2 goes out. So diffusion really is at the root of all of this. Now, one final picture. My little pretty box diagram is very simplistic and easy to follow the direction of blood, but I do want to remind you that it is a very simplistic diagram. Here's a much more realistic diagram where you can see those chambers looking much more complex, and you can kind of see the blood getting pumped to the lungs and then back and then to the body and then back. And so here's what we're going to sort of drive towards. So let's begin looking a little bit more closely at the different components of the circulatory system, today focusing on the heart. So here we have the anatomically correct diagram of a heart. Here's a hallmark version. The heart is made up of cardiac muscle. You may remember there's skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle. This is cardiac. And what's interesting and unique about cardiac muscle is it has these little things called intercalated discs that connect these adjacent cells. So this cell here is connected to this cell by this intercalated disc. And what that means is if an action potential is spreading through this cell, it can continue undisturbed through the intercalated disc to this cell. And what that means is all of the cells that make up the heart can contract all at the same time. And that's important for pumping blood. So you can see the muscle of the heart here, and you can see if you look at my picture in the little screen at the bottom, it kind of makes this little chamber, right? And so when all those muscles contract at once, it's kind of this like, they like squeeze. And it's literally squeezing the blood every time one of these chambers contracts. And so the structure of cardiac muscle ensures that all of these muscles are contracting as one in this unified movement. So to look more closely at the heart, there are 4 chambers. There's the left atrium, the left ventricle, the right atrium, and the right ventricle. You'll notice that the atria being the plural form of the word atrium, the atria are on the top of the heart, the ventricles are on the bottom of the heart. And then you'll notice that there's a septum that separates these out. Now, you may notice if you look at the walls of these different chambers, they're not equal. So if you compare this wall to the wall of the atria, take a moment and try and figure out which chambers are thicker, the atria and the ventricles, and why. And then left or right, which is thicker and why. And I will tell you the answer. First of all, the ventricles are thicker than the atria. That wall of muscle lining this chamber, this space, is thicker down here and over here than in these atria. And the reason why is the atria only have to pump that blood to the ventricle. In other words, when this chamber, the right atrium, contracts, it just goes, that's it, and the blood is in the heart. But when the right ventricle contracts, boom, it's got to pump the blood all the way to the lungs. Same over here, little atria just to the ventricle, but the ventricle's got to pump the blood, and on the left side, it's got to go to the entire body, to the head, to the legs, to the arm. And if you don't see that, take a look at that picture we colored, that flow map of blood flow, and you'll see that the little box diagram we made, the left ventricle is pumping blood to the body. And to the body means it's got to go to the head, to the arms, to the legs, to the inner organs, everywhere. And so this question, is left or right thicker? Well, look at the wall of the left ventricle, compare it to the wall of the right ventricle, and the left is definitely thicker. And again, that should make sense because the right ventricle is just pumping to the lungs, which are fairly close by, while the left ventricle has to get to all those other parts of the body. So the 4 chambers are actually different in the thickness of their walls, and it's based on how far they're pumping the blood. And again, that little flow map diagram using the box to represent the 4 chambers is really useful to kind of see that. Next, we have blood vessels in the heart, and there's a number of blood vessels going in and out. You can kind of see them all over the place. And let's just talk about what those are. So the pulmonary veins are these blood vessels right here that are coming from the lungs. So you can see them right here, and you can see them right there. Now, if you look at your little diagram, your box diagram of the heart, you should be able to tell which chamber the pulmonary veins coming from the lungs are going into. And that chamber is the left atrium. Find that on that box diagram and look at that. So the pulmonary veins come into the left atrium. The left atrium then pumps it to the left ventricle. And then the left ventricle pumps the blood out through the next blood vessel, which is the aorta. The aorta is the largest blood vessel in your entire body. It's about the diameter of your thumb, which is a pretty decent sized blood vessel. Fun fact, a blue whale is the largest creature ever to have existed on the planet. Its heart is about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, and its aorta is so wide that an adult human could swim through it. Shower afterwards. So the aorta is this blood vessel, and then you can see immediately we see branches. So this branch is going to head to the arm and to the neck. These branches are going to go to the other side of the neck and to the other arm. It's going to branch to the legs. We'll look at that branching and identify those blood vessels later, but for now, the aorta is kind of the gateway to all the other parts of the body. Big, important blood vessel. The blood that goes to the body then returns through the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. These two blood vessels bring the blood back to the right atrium. And again, look at that box flow map diagram, and you should see that blood from the body comes back to the right atrium. And then from there, it goes to the right ventricle, which pumps it out through the pulmonary arteries, which goes back to the lungs. So again, that box diagram is really going to be helpful in dissecting this and understanding how that works. Take a moment. Which blood vessel would you expect to be thicker? The aorta or the superior vena cava, and why? And the answer is the aorta. And the reason why is the left ventricle is pumping the blood into that aorta. And so when that left ventricle is going boom and pushing with a lot of force, that blood in the aorta is like, and that aorta needs a thick wall to absorb that force. Since the right ventricle is a little bit thinner walled, it doesn't produce quite as much force, and so the pulmonary arteries don't need to be quite as thick because they're not being exposed to quite as much force of blood. One final thing I want to point out, you might notice that there's these blood vessels lining the surface of the heart. These are the coronary arteries. These are what nourish the heart itself. So we're going to talk more about this in the context of heart attacks. But these are very important because they are what give the heart muscles themselves oxygen and nutrients. The last component of the heart are the valves. The valves ensure blood flows in the proper direction through the heart. They're kind of like a one-way door. You can go through in the proper direction, but if you try and go the other way, the door is blocked off and you can't go through. You can see the valves here, so blood can go this way through the valve. And then here's kind of a top view of the heart. This is a closed valve, and here's the open valve. Now, there's two major categories of valves. The atrioventricular valves sit between the atria and the ventricle, hence atrioventricular. The bicuspid valve, sometimes known as the mitral valve, sits between the left atrium and left ventricle, while the tricuspid valve sits between the right atrium and right ventricle. I use the mnemonic device LAM-RAT. LAM, left atrium, left atrium is the mitral or bicuspid valve. RAT, right atrium, has the tricuspid valve, and that's how I remember those. There are also semilunar valves. Semilunar valves sit between the ventricle and the blood vessel leaving the heart. And so you can see this is a semilunar valve right here, and this is a semilunar valve right here. The one leading to the aorta is called the aortic. The one leading to the pulmonary artery is the pulmonary. So that kind of makes sense. Now, you'll notice that there's a little difference in structure between the atrioventricular valves and the semilunar valves. The atrioventricular valves have these weird little white flappy things on them. These white cords are called chordae tendineae, and they basically anchor and reinforce that valve. They attach to what are called papillary muscles on the inside of the heart, um, and they reinforce that. The reason why they're needed is because they go between the ventricle and the atrium. So imagine this left ventricle pumps the blood. It's going to squeeze the blood. That blood is supposed to go out through the aorta. But when it's squeezing, a lot of blood is going to be slamming back against that atrioventricular valve. There's a lot of force on it. And so these chordae tendineae anchor and reinforce that valve so that when the blood slams into it, it can stay shut and not allow that blood to go back in the wrong direction. The semilunar valves don't need chordae tendineae because when the heart contracts, boom, then the blood is off and very little will come back and trickle down and hit that. Final thing I want to point out, the sound of your heart, the heartbeat, is actually the result of blood slamming against the valves. So the blood starts in the two atria and it goes in, and when it hits this first, the AV valve, that's the LUP. And then when the ventricles contract and send the blood out to these blood vessels, a little blood slams back against the semilunar valves, and that's the DUP. So every LUP DUP is simply the sound of the blood hitting those valves.